The massacre of Phocaea, Ispagitis Phocaeas, took place in the summer of 1914. In this massacre, much of the property of the Ottoman Greeks living in Phocaea was destroyed or taken over, and as many as 50 to 100 Phocaean men, women, and children were killed, with more dying in the aftermath while fleeing Phocaea. These events elicited sympathy throughout Europe, but especially in France in the city of Marseille, a city founded by Phocaea in the Archaic period. The people of Marseille raised a sum of 20,000 French francs, sending it to the refugees as an expression of support. The paper that follows is based on the observations I made from a database I assembled that attempts to record all instances of economic exchange in Herodotus. The database was made in spring 2017 for a much beloved Herodotus seminar that I took as a graduate student with Paula Perlman at the University of Texas at Austin. Though my current dissertation work is on late Bronze Age scripts, in particular the undeciphered Cypro-Minoan script of Cyprus, I had always wanted to do something with the database as it entailed a fairly large amount of labor to create. My wrists were sore for weeks after, and because I am, as the kids say, a Herodotus stan. When I first saw the emails advertising the Herodotus helpline last spring, fairly early in the pandemic, it felt like the perfect opportunity to do something with the database. I also felt seen. My friend and colleague Charles Campbell and I had already begun weekly meetings to read Herodotus. I was in need of a helpline as much as anyone. Thank you so much to Tom and Jan for organizing this amazing group and giving me the opportunity to present the database. As an outsider to the field, I hope that my stranger's perspective on the text will be of interest and that my failures to engage with sometimes obvious secondary literature on the passages in question will be forgiven. The intent behind the database has been to record the exchange of goods between people in Herodotus's The Histories, the geographical extents to which goods traveled, the people through which they traveled, and the different types of exchange responsible for their transmission. I am recording what the text tells us about the movements of goods, not theorizing about or reading economic models into the text. As Tom Harrison has brought to my attention, a similar approach was taken to Polybius, with much more deftness and expertise, by J.K. Davis, whose article, Mediterranean Economies Through the Text of Polybius, I quote, is not a study of Polybius as an economic historian or of Hellenistic economies through the interpretive eyes of Polybius. It is a study of those economies purely and simple through the text of Polybius, i.e. the patterns of behavior and the peoples and individuals represented in his extant text. I will begin tonight's paper by briefly introducing the database in the hopes that you in the audience can play around with it more easily for yourselves. And then I will present a series of observations about the most exchange-dense passages in Herodotus, to which the causes of the Persian War and the role of Samos are integral. For better or worse, this means that I will discuss well-trod passages in the histories. This coincidence in itself is one of the main takeaways for me in my work with the database, that exchange-dense passages are some of the most important and popular passages regarding the causes of the Persian Wars. I'm taking a broad view of exchange, including transfers of money and goods in commercial transactions, as well as those that are embedded, to use Polanyi's term, in religious contexts. The database does not include sacrifices in which animals or objects are destroyed, such as, for instance, Christ's sacrifice of 3,000 of every kind of appropriate animal, in addition to which he piled up gold and silver-plated couches, golden libation cups, and purple garments, and then burned them on a huge pyre, destroying an enormous amount of wealth, a sequence that precedes a series of even more ostentatious dedications to Delphi. I have included incidental exchanges of wealth, such as when the slave Skyton becomes rich by picking up the gold dropped by Democritus as he received fistful after fistful from the wives and children of Darius, thanking him for healing Darius's ankle bone in Book 3. The database consists of just under 500 individual entries, and I suspect that many more could be added to it, as I've not infrequently found more examples to add when I've been checking passages in preparation for the talk. I have categorized all the exchanges of goods into two basic types, transactions and compulsions. The category of transactions contains a relatively uniform subset of subcategories: sales, gifts, and dedications. These terms are all applied fairly generously. The term sale refers to items traded, payments for services, purchases of goods, and so on, which I indicate under the label column. And in the what column, I indicate the type of good being exchanged. The category of trade is somewhat problematic. I tried to only include instances where a good was explicitly mentioned as being traded, but for instance, sometimes included in the database goods that traveled in an unspecified manner. A nice example of this is the good frankincense, which Herodotus tells us originates exclusively from Arabia in Book 2. Despite the good's exclusive origins, we find frankincense widespread throughout the geographical map of the histories. 100 talents of frankincense is burnt during the sacrifices by Babylonians in Book 1. It is used by Egyptians in the sacrifices for Apophis in Book 2. The Scythian women pound its wood with other spices to make face masks in Book 4. And it is paid as tribute to Darius in the sum of 1,000 talents in Book 4. Only in the case of the tribute to Darius do we know the mechanism of exchange through which frankincense made its way around a large portion of Herodotus's globe. The database only considers concrete acts of exchange where a giver or a point of origin and a receiver or destination are indicated. Thus, it excludes general references to trading and other economic activity, such as the Purple Passage in Book 1:153, where Cyrus proclaims, "I have never yet feared any men who have a place in the center of the city set aside for meeting together, swearing false oaths, and cheating one another." For, as Herodotus explains, Cyrus thus insulted the Hellenes because of their custom of setting up agoras in their cities for the purpose of buying and selling, which is unknown to the Persians, who did not use markets and indeed have no such place as an agora in any of their cities. The category of gifts often, but not always, refer to exchanges involving the verb dorein and related nouns, but also the simple root do. I have labeled as guest friendship exchanges which involve actual or intended mutual exchange. One fuzzy but important category that is sometimes recorded as a gift transaction and sometimes as a compulsion is bribery, as there are instances in which the verb dorein is explicitly used in instances of bribery. The last category of transactions are dedications to temples, which includes all oracular inquiries, even where explicit references to payments are not made, since we know from Croesus's exemption from payments at Delphi in Book 1 and other historical and epigraphic sources beside, that payments would be expected in exchange for an oracle. The category of compulsion is much more variable. Subcategories include items plundered, given as tribute, items stolen, which are in the database as theft. Piracy, as in the theft of ships, is included under this heading, which may or may not have been the right decision. Slavery and more. A significant subcategory of compulsion is subjugation, which is the label I have given to the taking of land in war or otherwise. In analyzing the movement of goods in the histories and taking special note of passages that are dense with exchanges of various types, what becomes apparent to me is that exchange is at the heart of the causes for the Persian Wars. It is the mechanism through which the Greeks come east and the Persians come west. In these exchanges, Samos plays an integral and often disruptive role. Before the role, Samos is depicted as a stepping stone to Eastern wealth and as both a contact and rupture point between Greek city-states and their easterly and southerly neighbors. After the war, Samos assumes the role of boundary marker between the Greek city-states of the West and Asia to the East. The broad narrative, as told through the lens of exchange, begins with a large and interconnected world, one that's primarily made wide on the Greek side by Samians and Ionians. In the aftermath of the war, in Book 8, the Greek world has contracted significantly. The thematic backdrop to this expansion and contraction is the question of where in the world, literally, the Ionians belong. Acts of exchange in Herodotus are fundamentally connected with the overarching theme of the development of a web of interconnections between the Greek world and the East, which culminates in the Persian invasions. Herodotus's Histories begins with an etiology of the Trojan Wars that kicks off with the Phoenicians coming to Argos after stops in Egypt and Assyria for economic purposes. From the very outset, the Herodotean world encompasses lands far away from Greece, connected to one another by way of trade. The famous story that follows, which needs no retelling, connects Greece, Europe to Assyria, Asia, Egypt, Phoenicia, and Colchis in a logos involving commerce, theft, and other murkier motives. Of the major players in the histories, only Libya and Scythia are missing from this initial logos. The Trojan War logos, with exchange at its core, presages the exchange-centric logoi that Herodotus, by which of course I mean the Herodotean narrator, marks as bringing the Greeks to Asia for the first time and as bringing the Persians into Europe. The first of these logoi is the story of the Spartan bull supposedly stolen by the Samians, which Herodotus writes was the reason the Lacedaemonians say they went to war with the Samians. This expedition, Herodotus tells us, was the first into Asia of the Lacedaemonian Dorians. The second logos is the story of, quote, the first excursion of Darius into the West, on account of Democritus, the physician from Croton, who orchestrates his escape home to Croton from Persia by dragging the Persian army along with him. Both of these logoi, clearly demarcated by Herodotus as causes, if not of the war, then of the two main parties in the war coming into each other's geographic domains, are dense with exchanges. As Christopher Pelling has noted, Samos plays an integral role in both of these stories. And as I will argue here, Samos's integral role in both logi has strong economic dimensions. Samos is depicted as both a pivot point between the lesser wealth of the Greeks and the greater Persian and Egyptian wealth, and a gatekeeper of the networks of exchange between West and East. The logos of the Spartan incursion into Asia is split into three parts. The first part of the narrative is told in Book 1 in chapters 169 and 70. The two chapters which tell the story of the Lacedaemonian-Croesus alliance are dense with references to different types of exchange, both intended and enacted. The Spartans, entreated by Croesus to accept his alliance, did so under the previously established obligations of guest friendship. In a flashback, we are told how the Spartans had earlier traveled to Sardis to purchase gold from Croesus in order to contract the making of a statue of Apollo. Instead of allowing them to purchase the gold, Croesus gifts it to them. To repay Croesus, the Spartans had made a bronze vase, a bronze bowl, 300 amphorae in size, which they sent to Croesus as a gift. The vase, on its course to Croesus, was either stolen by enterprising Samians or was sold to them by the Lacedaemonians who had recently learned of Croesus's defeat at the hands of Cyrus. Either way, the Samians who came into the possession of the bowl ultimately dedicated it to the Horion of Samos. The story of the bowl and the war it caused, at least according to the Lacedaemonians' explanation of the war, is then picked up in Book 3 in two separate sections, 344 to 78 and 354 to 356. In each of these short sections in the logos, Samos is depicted as a gatekeeper of exchange between mainland Greeks and foreign rulers in the East and South. The war ends unceremoniously with the Lacedaemonians unable to breach the Samian walls, or, according to a story Herodotus finds unbelievable, with Polycrates bribing the Lacedaemonians with the payment of fake money, lead coins coated with electrum. The true end of the logos comes a few chapters later in 360, where Herodotus proclaims, "I've given a rather lengthy account of the Samians because they achieved the three greatest engineering works of all Hellenes." So that is why I went on at some length about the Samians. The logos of Democritus and the first excursion of Darius into the West is likewise dense with different types of exchange. The Logos begins roughly in 3130 with Democritus, now a Persian slave, receiving the gift of golden fetters from Darius as payment for curing his broken ankle that none of the Egyptian doctors at his court were able to heal. In addition to the fetters, Democritus received so much gold from the wives and children of Darius that a slave in the court, Scion, becomes rich by trailing Democritus and collecting the fallen gold he was unable to carry. The Logos then flashes back to Democritus' origins in Croton, which he leaves in order to escape an abusive father, empty-handed, and then begins a Horatio Alger up by the bootstrap circuit that takes Democritus east to Persia and back west to Croton, this time incredibly wealthy and with the Persian army in tow. Having left Croton, Democritus goes to Aegina, where he begins work as a doctor. In the first year, so poor he's unable to buy his equipment. In the second year, under the employ of the Aeginan city-state for 1 talent, approximately 82 Attic mina. In the third year, he moves to Athens, where he receives a pay bump, making 100 Attic mina. And in the fourth year, he moves to the court of Polycrates, where he makes an even better salary of 2 talents worth 120 Attic mina, but meets the misfortune of slavery when he travels with Polycrates to visit Oitanes, who summarily executes Polycrates in grisly fashion. The Logos then jumps forward to Democritus' enslavement in the house of Darius, where he is living in great fortune. In exchange for curing Darius' wife, Atossa, of what sounds a lot like a metastasized breast tumor, he asks Atossa to repay him by helping him escape back to Croton. Atossa's contrivance to get Democritus west is to tell Darius that she desires slave women, specifically Laconian, Argive, Athenian, and Corinthian slaves. Darius accepts his wife's entreaties and recruits Democritus to go west, outfitting him with a merchant vessel on the pretext of conducting business to act as his spy. Atossa and Democritus' ruse works, and Democritus makes his escape to Croton. The Persians who follow him briefly detain him in the Agora of Croton, a detail which seems to take on significance given that the Logos is so dense with different types of economic exchange. Democritus is able to escape, and he bids the Persians leave, keeping the merchant ship. And the story ends with Democritus spending a large sum of money, quote, to marry the daughter of Milon the wrestler. In both logoi, Samos's role is that of a transition point and gatekeeper between mainland Greeks and foreign rulers in the east and south. The first logos in particular emphasizes Samos's gatekeeper role as it shows Samos intercepting attempted gift exchanges between mainland Greeks and 3 different foreign rulers. Samos intercepts or otherwise receives the Spartan bowl being given as a gift to Croesus by the Lacedaemonians in Book 1, steals a corselet Amasis was gifting to the Spartans a year earlier, and Samos intercepts the 300 Corcyraean boys that the Corinthians were gifting to Aleates. From these stories, it appears that Samos was an important way station through which goods traveled from foreign lands to mainland Greek city-states, and that Samos exerted power through its position. Samos's exertion of power as gatekeeper through its interception of exchanges certainly had a symbolic as opposed to merely profit-oriented dimension, as is evident in the nature of the bowl gifted by the Spartans to Croesus. The bowl is described as large, bronze, decorated, 300 amphorae in size. While this description might make it seem that the bowl was quite grand, the bowl is really a paltry gift in Croesusian terms. We know that by comparison to the bowl that Croesus, the intended recipient of the gift, sent to Delphi in Book 1, 50.2. This bowl, which was one of 2 bowls Croesus gifted and only a small part of a much larger gift, was entirely made of silver and large enough to hold 600 amphorae, double the size of the Spartan bowl and made of a more precious metal. The Spartans' intended gift exchanged in an act of guest friendship, was likely not commensurate in value to the gift of gold they had received from Croesus, and was half the size of one of two bulls and a greater gift that Croesus gave to Delphi. The Spartan bull probably would not have been judged as magnificent by the incredibly wealthy Croesus, and seems to violate the basic tenets of gift exchange, where a gift given in return should be of more value than the gift received. The Samians, who either stole the bull or bought it, did not do so for profit, but rather dedicated the bull to the Horion, where the gift would have symbolized Samos's power to control exchanges between the Greek city-states and foreign rulers. The stories of Samos's thievery and interception of gift exchanges implicitly contrast with the famous story of Polycrates' ring, a story of excess reciprocity, and the story of Silason's cloak, in which both Silason, the exiled brother of Polycrates of Samos, and Darius enact a perfect gift exchange. Amasis' decision to back out of his guest friendship with Polycrates after the story of the ring, out of concern for, quote, what Polycrates had attempted to throw away had been restored to him. It is an inversion of Samos's behavior as an interceptor of gift exchanges, receiving things that had been given to them. In light of Samos's thievery, Amasis' comment predicts the fate of the island of Samos itself, which, after the death of Polycrates, passes between different hands some 5 different times. Samos's role as transition or pivot point between Greek mainland and foreign lands manifests itself in 2 ways in these logoi. The first is geographical. In the Logos of the Samian War, Herodotus situates Samos in Asia and tells us that the Lacedaemonians entered Asia, aka Samos, for the first time during the war. This is, of course, not strictly true. Samos had sent messengers to Croesus to purchase gold for him, the impetus for the eventual war that followed. Perhaps the distinction here is between Spartan envoys and the army as a whole. At any rate, Samos is the first entry point into Asia for the Spartans, and Democritus' last home base before landing in Darius' palace at Susa. The transitional quality of Samos in the Democritus logos is emphasized as Samos is grouped together in the list of Greek city-states who pay Democritus increasing sums of money for his services as he makes his way east. Samos, his easternmost landing spot in the series of Greek city-states, pays him the most. The salary of 2 talents paid to him by the Samians, of course, pales in comparison to the wealth that he accumulates at Darius' court. But the implication is Samos has something of the wealth of the East as compared to the other Greek city-states. This conclusion is strengthened by Herodotus' choice to end the Samian logoi with the megalathemata of the Samians, the only Hellenes whose work recall that of foreign rulers described throughout the histories, and to call Polycrates the most magnificent of all the Greek tyrants, excepting the Syracusans. Over the course of the histories, Samos and the sanctuary of Hera in particular come to house 2 symbols of the movements of Greeks east and Persians west. The first is the already discussed Spartan bull, and the second is the painting commemorating Mandrocles of Samos's construction of the bridge of boats that span the Bosporus. The Bosporus, Herodotus tells us in 445, is one of the places people place the nebulous boundaries of Europe, the others being the Colchian Phasis River or the Maeotic Tanais. Darius certainly holds the view that the Bosporus is the entryway into Europe, telling Atossa, in response to her initial attempt to help Democritus escape back west, that he had already had plans to build a bridge, quote, from this continent to the other one, and to conduct a military campaign against the Scythians. Mandrocles of Samos, who eventually built the bridge, received gifts as payment from Darius, and his tithe, which he dedicates to the sanctuary of Hera, is, quote, a picture painted to portray the entire bridge over the Bosporus, with King Darius sitting on his chair of state and the army crossing over the bridge. Thus, the Horion, one of the three Samian Thalma, comes to hold two symbols memorializing some of the first encounters between the West and East. The bull that brought the Spartans east, and the painting that depicts Darius crossing into Europe. The second way in which Samos acts as a transition point is of economic fortune or status. Samos serves as the transition point through which Democritus, a free man in the employ of the magnificently wealthy Polycrates, ends up an even more wealthy and well compensated as a slave in Persia. Samos is Democritus' stepping stone towards Eastern wealth in the place where his status changes from free man to slave. The story recalls that of the Thracian Rhodopis, whose status changes from enslaved to free after a stopover in Samos. The Thracian Rhodopis was a slave in Samos, from where she was taken to Egypt to work while enslaved under another Samian, at which point her freedom was purchased by Caracas, the Mytilenean, brother of Sappho's. Rhodopis, like Democritus, goes on to acquire significant wealth, though exactly how much is debated, as Herodotus' story of her dedications of iron oboloi to Delphi is a little ironic. In addition to the two exchange dense logoi discussed above, which explain how the Spartans came to Asia and the Persians to Europe, exchange dense logoi also feature in the stories of how the Athenians became great, told in Book 5, how the Alcmenidae become wealthy and influential in Book 6, and how the Aeginetans become great in Book 9. I do not have the time to discuss these logoi, but they are worth mentioning inasmuch as they also speak to exchange as a major explanatory force for the main characters' presence in the Persian Wars. I would like to end this lecture by looking at the role the Ionians and Samians play in long-distance trade before the war, and contrast this with the mediating geographical position that Samos plays when the Ionians meet with the Greek city-states in the aftermath of Salamis to discuss the fate of their communities in Book 8, chapters 122 to 135, itself an exchange-rich section. Herodotus tells us in 163 that the Phocians are the first of the Greeks, proto-Elenon, to conduct long-distance sea travel, a story which he tells in a flashback in the midst of detailing the first threats on the Ionians by Persians to the east. The story of the Phocians is chock full of exchange. The Phocians were the first Greeks to go to the city of Tartessus, where the Tartessian king Argonautheus takes a liking to them and offers to resettle them in his lands at west, an offer which we are made to think, based on its position in the narrative, they should have taken. His offer of a new homeland rejected, King Argonautheus offers to the Phocians money to build a significant circuit wall. They build the wall, which, despite its hardiness, is not enough to keep the Phocians safe. The narrative flashes forward to the present narrative moment with the Phocians fleeing from the Persians. First, they go to Chios and offer to purchase a nearby island, but their offer is rejected because the Chians perceive them as trade partners and worry they'll set up an emporium. They then go out west to Corsica, where they had earlier established a colony, Alalia. But the Phocians plunder widely once they get west and upset their neighbors, leading to a war with the Carthaginians and the Tyrrhenians. The story is capped by a conference of the Ionians, where two proposals for a new Ionian homeland, one made by Bias of Priene to move west to Sardinia and establish a pan-Ionian city there, and another by Thales of Miletus to establish a federation based out of Chios. Book 4 again sees Greeks, this time the Samians, going west, quote, beyond the pillars of Heracles and ending up at Tartessus, where they become rich. The Samians' rediscovery of Tartessus is told as part of the establishment of Cyrene. The Cyrene logos is replete with exchanges of various types, including references to trade and traders that are not recorded in the database, such as Chorobrius, the man of Itanos on Crete, who was a purple dye dealer, and the Theran Themison, who was living at Axis in Crete as a merchant, Oemboros. The Samians enter the story with Corobius, the purple dye dealer, stationed on the island of Plataea in Libya, awaiting the return of the Therans and low on supplies. A Samian ship on its way to Egypt, we can assume for purposes of trade based on what follows, happens upon the stranded Corobius and offers him provisions. Departing from Libya, the Samians are knocked off course. Again, I quote, beyond the pillars of Heracles and end up in Tartessus, which, in possible contradiction to the Phocaian story above, is described as a virgin trade port. The Samians conduct trade with Tartessus and become rich, making a greater profit than any Greeks before their day, excepting Sostratus, son of Laodamas and Aeginetan. From their proceeds, the Samians fund the construction of a large brazen bull, 6 talents in weight in the Argive style. Unfortunately, I don't know how to convert talents to amphorae, so I don't know how this bull compares to the others we've looked at. And they dedicate this bull to the Horion at Samos, yet another dedication that memorializes East-West interconnection. The Samian and Phocaian adventures out west contrast remarkably with the council held between the Ionians and Greeks after Salamis in Book 8, 132, to discuss the fate of the Ionians. The conference, which is held in Egina, is described mostly through narration as opposed to direct speech. The lead up to the conference narrates the movements of Persians and the various Greek city-states. At the time of the conference, the narrator tells us that the Persians are positioned at Samos, but are afraid to go further west than that, and that the Greeks go as far as Delos, but manage to go no further, also due to fear. Once again, Samos is the line demarcating east from west. As Herodotus tells us, the Greeks stopped at Delos. Quote, for the Hellenes were terrified of everything that lay beyond that point, since they were not familiar with that territory, and they feared that the whole region was garrisoned by enemy forces. Besides, they firmly believed that Samos was as far away from them as the Pillars of Heracles. The narrator's observation here reads as an accusation in light of the interconnected and well-traveled Mediterranean of the earlier books. As we know, Greeks frequently traveled east and west, especially the Ionians and Samians, but so too did the Greek city-states. And Herodotus has told us about various individual members of Greek city-states who traveled to the court of Croesus or Darius, as in the case of Spartans in Book 1 and Democritus in Book 3. The Democritus story especially depicts the traversable Mediterranean world connected by means of exchange. The reference to the Pillars of Heracles here is especially pointed as it calls to mind the Samian trade endeavors at Tartessus, through which pillars, Herodotus tells us, the Samians passed on their way. The term Pillar of Heracles, used here to mean unimaginably far away, is shown in the Cyrenian logos to be not only that far away after all, but a place that becomes part of the Samians' economic orbit. Referring to Samos as far away as the Pillars of Heracles represents a significant contraction of the Greek world. The accusation that the Greek mainland world has contracted, or perhaps allegedly contracted, continues a few chapters later in 8:135 in the logos of the Theban oracle, which delivered its readings in a foreign tongue that none of the Thebans in attendance could decipher. A story that Herodotus says is a megiston thauma. As the story goes, only Mies the European of Thessaly was able to identify the language in which the oracle had spoken, which turns out to have been Carian, the language of the Western Ionian coast that would have been well known to the Ionians of Asia Minor, and at least recognizable by ear to any Greeks who had traveled further east than Samos. And the story of the oracle, positioned in the narrative just after the Council of the Ionians and the Greeks at Delos, constitutes an accusation on the part of the narrator. Greek provincialism in a widely interconnected and transversal Mediterranean is to blame for the lack of Ionian safety in their homeland. What is less clear to me is whether this is an accusation about the facts of the matter, i.e. the mainland Greek world is smaller than the Samian or Ionian one, or of blame. The Mediterranean is a pond, why are you frogs suddenly so afraid to jump? Because while it is clear from the database that Herodotus's Mediterranean is interconnected and easily traversed, at least one Greek city-state, Athens, is shown in fact to be quite provincial. Athens, at least as a corporate body, travels to and exchanges almost exclusively with the mainland Greek world. Individual Athenians go further, such as Alcmaeon on his ludicrous trip to the court of Crisis, where he stuffs his pockets and mouth in sacks with gold dust. But the Athenians, oi Athenaioi, stay within the Greek realm. The contracted world of Athens is highlighted in the oracle pertaining to Lemnos, which says that when Attica can reach Lemnos in a single day, an impossible feat, the island will be theirs. The oracle is finally fulfilled by Miltiades when he sails to Lemnos from Attican Chersonesus. Herodotus's accusation against the mainland Greek city-states then reflects the facts of the story, at least in the case of Athens. The Mediterranean is large and interconnected for some, but not all. The fact that some, such as the Ionians, have opted into this interconnected web of exchange where the Athenians have not, has left the Ionians in a vulnerable position. The Athenians and the other Greek city-states could easily access Ionia and beyond and know it, but they have chosen not to. Returning back to the narrative as a whole, what becomes evident to my mind is that Herodotus depicts a well-connected Mediterranean where goods are transacted widely and through a variety of means. To the west with Tartessus, in the southern direction with Egypt and the Ethiopians, to the north with Scythia and beyond the place of the feathers, and east to Susa and beyond. Many, but not all, Greek-speaking peoples are embedded in these exchanges. Samos is marked in various ways as a transition point. It gatekeeps guest friendships, exchanges going west from Greek city-states to Eastern rulers and from Amasis in Egypt to the Spartans. It is the last stop for both Democritus and Rhodopis before they transition their status from free to enslaved, as in the case of Democritus, and from enslaved to free, as in the case of Rhodopis. Samos's vast wealth is compared to the other Greek city-states in terms of its marvelous constructions and the magnificence of Polycrates himself, and signal it as a place with at least one foot in foreign wealth. As the Persian Wars wind down in Book 8, we find a much contracted Mediterranean, at least for the Greek city-states. As the Ionians worry for the safety of their homeland, the Greek city-states cannot be bothered to pass Delos. For some city-states like Sparta, this is an about face and flies in the face of exchanges detailed in earlier books. For others, like Athens, this is consistent with its behavior, at least when it acts as a corporate body. For the wide-ranging and wide trading Eastern Greeks, mainland Greek provincialism has become a problem.